Hi there, welcome to How to D&D. My name's Frederick Weller and today I want to talk about why everybody should be a dungeon master. Now I know what people are thinking and going to say, well I can't buy all the books, there's too many books and I just don't have the money. But you don't need the books to be a dungeon master, and you don't actually have to be that good at it to dungeon master. Quite a while ago, one of the subscribers asked me to do a video on how to deal with difficult dungeon masters or problem dungeon masters and problem players, and I really didn't want to do those videos. I have avoided that particular subject, so this is why I'm doing this video, because I think this is probably the best way to deal with that. There are already so many videos on YouTube, on the internet, that you can watch that talk about dealing with problem players and dungeon masters. And I have a problem with providing people with advice, which one may be the wrong advice, because I do not know your particular situation, so giving you advice isn't necessarily going to give you the correct answer for your situation. In fact, there might not be a correct answer to your situation. But if everybody was to be a dungeon master, I feel that a lot of the conflicts and problems that arise between the players and the dungeon master would be corrected, or at least minimized, by actually having this happen. I play in a group privately where everybody dungeon masters. I have for years. I run games for other dungeon masters. I run games for new players, but often I have tables where everybody is a dungeon master at my table. I'm not suggesting that a new player become a dungeon master, although there's really nothing wrong with that. If you are with a group of people who have never played before and you're a new dungeon master, your players are probably not going to know if you are making a mistake or not. It really doesn't matter that much. And if you share the load, it's going to make life and the enjoyment of Dungeons and Dragons so much better. That being said, give it a year playing as a character, and when you feel you've got the gist of the rules sorted out, you don't have to be perfect, you just have to know enough, give it a go. Everybody should be rotating. That way nobody burns out and nobody winds up being able to play any kind of power game. Can you imagine what would happen at a table where everybody was a dungeon master? Where everybody had the chance to play as a character? There's never going to be a situation where one particular dungeon master who's the only person in your location runs the game, because everybody at your table can run the game. That's the great thing about making sure everybody does dungeon master. The more people that dungeon master means the more people who can play the game. And I can tell you now, there's always a shortage of dungeon masters. If more people dungeon master, more people play the game gets stronger, it gets more healthy, it gets bigger, and that's actually a good thing. So if you pick up the mantle of actually being a dungeon master, whether it be for a week, a month, a year, it doesn't matter, you are going to be able to see and experience what it's like for the dungeon master to run a game for a group of people who are often going to be requiring all sorts and demanding quite a lot from them, and then trying to figure out how to adjudicate the rules, plus all the options that are available. It can get extremely complicated for a dungeon master. Understanding the dungeon master's perspective is very healthy and very helpful. What's going to happen if your dungeon master gets to play the game because you are dungeon mastering? Well, one, they're going to get to play a character, and they will actually experience all the things that you were experiencing when they were dungeon mastering, because the chances are you will do pretty much what they did. When I was learning to dungeon master, I copied what other people did. And then they will understand, well, hang on, when I was doing that, that's how I felt as a player. If they don't ever have the experience of being a player, they won't understand what it's like. If you come across a dungeon master that you simply can't tolerate for whatever reason, or the group can't tolerate, you have options available now. If everybody can dungeon master, they don't actually have to run the game. Somebody else can take over. And that gives you more options than you had before. One of the great things about Dungeons and Dragons 5e is the rule system. The core rule system is a lot simpler than it was. Now, if you're pretty good with the core rules, that's great. But if you're not, by being a dungeon master, you will grasp the concepts much more astutely. Your understanding of the core rules will improve by dungeon mastering. There is no other way to do it. You simply do have to improve if you dungeon master. You will have to actually look at reviewing rules. You'll have to check sections. If there are things you don't understand because you haven't read them or you don't understand them for whatever reason, eventually your players are going to force you into a situation where you do have to understand them. Hence why I say it is not important to know the rules back to front and worry about being the referee completely. You know, there are ways of having groups where you have somebody who's potentially a rules lawyer or a player who is sort of like the sage at the table. The Dungeon Master doesn't always have to fill that role. Every Dungeon Master has to role play a lot of different characters. They have non-player characters they have to play all the time. So if you're a player who plays pretty much the same character all the time, you're going to get plenty of practice actually playing something else, something that you've never played before, and that's really going to make your ability to role play grow and develop. If you weren't too sure how a particular monster worked, when the Dungeon Master says this monster has this particular ability, you will understand because you have read the stat block, ran the monster in an adventure yourself, and that's really going to make a big improvement in your understanding of why a Dungeon Master did something a particular way. You've got to also bear in mind, not all monsters run at the table are going to be straight out of the monster manual, and Dungeon Masters make adjustments just to throw off players who sit there and spend hours reading the book, or have a photographic memory and can remember every single stat, every detail about every single monster. So this is the really big one. One of the great things about dungeon mastering is you have to deal with different styles of play. You have to deal with the power gamers, you have to deal with the people who like combat and fighting, you have to deal with people who like just to role play or just like the story side of things. They're not worried too much about combat, they just want a really good story. Other people who like to act like it, they want to act it out, they want to use an accent. So all those different styles of play are going to be something that as a dungeon master you have to compromise with, you need to adjust, you need to give something that everybody understands. The days of, oh, but just make sure everybody at the table plays exactly the same way. Well, it's not going to happen that way. It's simply too difficult. You are always going to have a variety of different people at your table who play a different way, and as a dungeon master you will understand why your players operate a particular way by dungeon mastering. It's one of the things you really have to do is figure out how to manage people and their different preferences by actually dungeon mastering. As a player you don't really kind of have to, you're not forced into the situation where you have to understand that, and dungeon mastering does that for you. Organisational skills. As a dungeon master there's always the saying you've got to be like the most organised person at the table. Not necessarily true, but if you haven't got particularly good organisational skills, they are definitely going to improve. You're going to be put into a situation where you're going to have to either figure out how to organise yourself better, or you're going to have to figure out how to adjust your way of organising for the way that you operate. So if you're sort of person who does everything at the last minute, then your organisational skills are going to consist of how do I learn how to improvise so I don't have to have a whole lot of information prepared. If I don't have time to read everything, then how do I adjust to that? And that's the other thing, improvising. If you are no good at improvising on the fly, dungeon mastering will make you do that. That's always going to be the place. You know as a player that throwing your dungeon master off is very, very easy, throwing something at them that they weren't prepared for, that wasn't in the book that they're running, or if they've got their own adventure, then, you know, basically you will try to give them a curveball. I know my players do it to me all the time. They try to figure out, well, what would actually cause a bit of stress for Fred, and see if he can actually pop a blood vessel. That's always part and parcel of learning how to be a dungeon master, but your improvising skills will improve. They simply don't have a choice but to improve. One of the things that I found as a dungeon master is if I played a game with another dungeon master, I could pick up and learn from them. I've learned from so many people over the years, and only by being a player at their table and by dungeon mastering for them, because dungeon masters always give each other feedback. As a general rule, I find that they steal from each other, and that's actually a good thing. You can call it stealing, you can call it borrowing, but if there's something that somebody else is doing better than you are, or slightly more, it's improved, or you just like the way they do a particular thing because it feels right, or it seems to cause less stress at the table, or the players enjoy it, or it doesn't really matter. Dungeon masters learn from each other, and by dungeon mastering you actually create a situation where everybody learns from each other. Growth always comes from trying things that you thought you couldn't do. And if you thought you couldn't be a dungeon master, I can tell you now, you can. And there are many channels on YouTube, many websites that talk about how to dungeon master. I love Matthew Colville. He has spent a lot of time, he's very popular, talking about how to run games, how to dungeon master. And this is actually really, really important. There are a few other places where people talk about how to dungeon master, but Matthew Colville goes into it in a lot of detail. I will put a link in the description because I know that's pretty much what his channel's all about. Now if you're going to say, but I have issues with my dungeon master because of the way they interpret the rules, or their view of the rules, or they don't understand the rules. Look, Dungeons and Dragons is a game written in a book that can be modified by the dungeon master. That's always been the case. There's always going to be a clash in some way between players and the dungeon master and other players. I've seen two different players argue the different points of a particular rule and sat there as a dungeon master and just waited until they finally let it out of their system. It is a ridiculous situation. But by dungeon mastering you will start to understand that there are situations where you need to be a bit more flexible with your players, and other situations where you need to be quite firm, and then that will actually help when you're a player because you'll understand why the dungeon master is doing that. Playing a character in a game and dungeon mastering is really the full experience of Dungeons and Dragons. I keep hearing, I'm looking for a dungeon master, I'm a player, I don't dungeon master. And really, it isn't divided up into two different camps where you have people who are dungeon masters and people who run characters, who are players. The game is supposed to be played on both sides, and really you are missing out on so much by not engaging in dungeon mastering. That's everything I have on why everybody should dungeon master. I really hope that people found this useful. If you did, please share, like and subscribe, but it really doesn't matter if you share, like and subscribe as long as you watch the videos and you got something out of it. If you have a comment about your concerns, your fears about dungeon mastering and why you don't, by all means put them in the comments, and maybe I can come up with something that will help you move from just being a player to also being a dungeon master. Until next time, keep rolling those 20s.